The town of Blackwood Creek, Nebraska, wasn't the kind of place that made the evening news. It was a community stitched together by gravel roads, endless fields of genetically modified corn, and families who had owned the same plots of land since the Homestead Act of 1862. In places like this, silence is a neighbor you get used to. But in the late summer of 2024, that silence began to rot. Ethan Mitchell was a third-generation corn farmer. At 42, his face was lined by the harsh Midwestern sun, and his hands were calloused from decades of manual labor. He didn't believe in ghosts, and he certainly didn't believe in flying saucers. To Ethan, the sky was either a source of rain or a source of hail. Nothing more had started on a Tuesday night, just past midnight. The air was thick with the suffocating humidity that always precedes a severe prairie thunderstorm. Ethan was sitting on his front porch, sipping cold, sweet tea, watching the horizon flicker with distant sheet lightning. His hound dog, Buster, was curled at his feet, panting heavily. Suddenly, Buster stood up. The dog's hackles raised, a low, vibrating growl forming deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" "Coyotes?" Ethan muttered, leaning forward. Buster didn't bark. Instead, the dog did something Ethan had never seen before. He whimpered, tucked his tail between his legs, and scratched frantically at the screen door to get inside. Ethan stood up, his hand automatically dropping to the pocket knife clipped to his jeans. The distant thunder had stopped. In fact, every sound had stopped. The constant, rhythmic drone of the cicadas and crickets had vanished in an instant. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange, metallic static electricity that made the hairs on Ethan's arms stand up. Then, the light came. It didn't drop from the clouds. It seemed to bleed out of the sky. A dull, copper-colored luminescence bathed the eastern 40-acre lot. Ethan stepped off the porch, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel driveway. He walked toward the edge of the cornfield, the stalks towering over 10 feet high, forming a dense, impenetrable wall of green. As he reached the first row of corn, he smelled it. It was the scent of ozone and copper, like a car battery that had burst open in the heat. Hovering completely silently above the center of his field was an object. It wasn't a saucer. It was a massive, irregular shape like a jagged chunk of obsidian or volcanic glass, completely devoid of reflection except for 3 pulsing amber apertures on its underbelly. It didn't look like technology. It looked like a piece of a nightmare that had broken off and fallen into the physical world. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The object was perhaps 200 feet in the air, but the sheer presence of it felt like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. Then, the corn began to move. Not from the wind. There was no wind. The stalks were being parted from within the field. Ethan watched in horror as something began to emerge from the darkness of the rows. It wasn't the classic gray alien of pop culture. What stepped out into the faint copper light was a towering, skeletal silhouette. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its limbs impossibly long and disjointed, moving with a sickening, arachnid-like grace. Its skin looked like wet charcoal, tightly stretched over a frame that seemed to defy anatomy. But the most terrifying feature was its face. It had no eyes, no nose, only a vertical slit that pulsed with the same amber light as the craft above. Ethan tried to scream, but his throat was completely paralyzed. He tried to run, but his boots felt as though they had been cemented into the Nebraska dirt. The entity stopped at the edge of the field, barely 20 feet from where Ethan stood. The vertical slit on its face slowly peeled open. Inside there were no teeth, only a void of shifting, iridescent color that looked like oil on water. A sound filled Ethan's head. It didn't travel through his ears. It resonated directly inside his cranium. It was a wet, clicking noise, followed by a voice that sounded like a choir of children screaming underwater. "We have found the marrow." The craft above pulsed violently. A beam of amber light struck the entity, and in a fraction of a second, both the creature and the object vanished. The silence broke instantly as a torrential downpour slammed into the earth, accompanied by a deafening crack of thunder. Ethan collapsed into the mud, his nose bleeding profusely. When he finally staggered back to his house, he looked at the kitchen clock. It was 4:15 a.m. Over 4 hours had passed in what felt like 4 minutes. The next morning, Ethan walked out to the field. In the center of the eastern lot, a perfect circle of corn had been completely incinerated, not flattened, but reduced to a fine silver ash that smelled faintly of copper and old formalin. But the real horror was found 3 days later. Ethan's neighbor, an old rancher named Silas Vance, went missing that same night. When the search party finally checked Silas's isolated cabin, they found the doors locked from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood. The only thing left of Silas Vance was his clothes, laid out perfectly on his bed as if he had simply dissolved out of them. And written on the bedroom wall in a greasy, black residue that the state police could never identify were 4 words: "The marrow is ours." Ethan Mitchell sold his farm a month later. He lives in a windowless apartment in Lincoln now, but he still keeps the lights on at night, because every time the air gets heavy before a storm, he can hear that wet, clicking sound inside his head, reminding him that something in the sky knows exactly what he tastes like. Deep in the Appalachian ridges of southwestern Virginia sits a settlement called Oak Haven. It's a place where the roads are steep, the trees are ancient, and the locals still practice old-world remedies. In Oak Haven, people know that some things are best left unsaid, especially when it comes to the lights that dance on Clinch Mountain Dot in October of 2025. Clara Hayes moved back to her grandfather's old cabin after his passing. Clara was a data analyst, a woman who lived by logic, numbers, and hard evidence. She had spent the last 7 years in Atlanta and had forgotten the oppressive darkness of the mountain nights. Her grandfather, modern folks said, had gone soft in the head before he died. He had covered every window of the cabin with heavy aluminum foil and had disconnected the main electrical breaker, living entirely by candlelight. Clara assumed it was just dementia. She was wrong. On her 3rd night in the cabin, Clara was working on her laptop using a portable cellular hotspot. The wind was howling through the pines outside, making the old timber framework groan. Around 2 a.m., her laptop screen began to glitch. Horizontal bands of green and violet static tore across her spreadsheet. Then, the audio monitor she used to listen for wild animals outside crackled to life. Instead of the usual wind or the occasional hoot of an owl, the speaker emitted a steady, rhythmic pulse. Chirp, chirp, chirp. It sounded like a marine sonar, but it had an organic quality to it, like a heartbeat made of glass. Clara walked to the kitchen window, peeling back a corner of the foil her grandfather had left behind. She peered out into the dense woods that sloped up toward the ridge of Clinch Mountain. The woods were glowing. A pale, bioluminescent fog was rolling down the mountainside, hugging the ground like dry ice vapor. It wasn't white or gray. It was a sickening neon turquoise. As the fog touched the ancient oak trees, the leaves didn't rustle. They stiffened, turning a brittle, frosty white in seconds. Clara felt a sudden, sharp pain in her jaw. Her dental fillings began to vibrate, producing a high-pitched, metallic hum that vibrated through her skull. She dropped to her knees, clutching her head, as the audio monitor on the counter began to screech with human-like voices distorted by heavy radio interference. "Help us. It's so cold. The blue is here." The voices belonged to people Clara knew. One was her grandfather's voice, unmistakable in its raspy Appalachian drawl. Another was young Danny Miller, a boy who had wandered into the woods 3 years prior and was never found, terrified. Clara dragged herself to the front door and looked through the peephole. 3 objects were descending from the mountaintop. They weren't mechanical structures. They looked like massive translucent jellyfish composed of pure glowing turquoise plasma. They drifted through the treetops without breaking branches, their long, tendril-like streamers of light dragging along the forest floor. As these entities drifted closer to the cabin, Clara looked through the window foil again. Beneath the floating plasma shapes, the ground was alive. The forest floor was covered in hundreds of pale, translucent human figures. They were walking in a slow, catatonic procession, their eyes glowing with the same turquoise light. They weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They looked like physical bodies that had been emptied of their humanity and filled with something foreign. Among them stood her grandfather, wearing the same overalls he was buried in, his face expressionless, his arms swinging limply at his sides. One of the plasma jellyfish hovered directly over the cabin. The tin roof began to groan under an immense gravitational pressure. Clara felt her body becoming light, her feet lifting an inch off the hardwood floor. The high-pitched hum in her head resolved into a single, terrifying consciousness. It wasn't a voice. It was an emotion, a vast, ancient, and completely malevolent curiosity. It was studying her, peeling back the layers of her mind like pages in a book. It knew her fears, her memories, her name. Clara, the mountain whispered through the static of the radio. With a final, desperate burst of energy, Clara crawled into her grandfather's old root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards. The cellar was lined with old iron railroad spikes, an old mountain superstition to keep away the stray lights. The moment she dropped into the damp earth of the cellar, the gravity returned to normal, and the screaming in her head stopped. She lay there in the dark, shivering, listening to the heavy, rhythmic thumping of things moving on the roof above her head throughout the night. It sounded like wet leather being dragged across the tin. When the sun finally rose, Clara climbed out of the cellar. The cabin was a disaster. Every electronic device, her laptop, her phone, her digital watch, had been melted into a solid lump of plastic and wire from the inside out. She ran out to her car, but the battery was completely dead. The acid inside boiled dry. She had no choice but to walk the 6 miles down the mountain road to the nearest neighbor's house. As she walked down the gravel road, She noticed the trees. For miles around her cabin, every single leaf on the ancient oaks had turned completely white, their veins pulsing with a faint, residual turquoise, fluid that dripped onto the gravel like glowing blood. The sheriff told her it was a localized chemical spill or an unusual weather phenomenon, but Clara knew better. She never went back for her belongings. She left Oak Haven that very day. Sometimes, when she's driving alone at night in the city and her car radio hits a patch of dead static between stations, she can still hear that glass heartbeat, chirp, 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 and underneath it, her grandfather's voice whispering from the heart of Clinch Mountain, asking her why she didn't join the dance.